The wind sounds like tearing metal, minus 47 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature is still falling. You are standing on frozen ocean in total darkness, more than 200 miles from the nearest tree. The sun disappeared below the horizon 19 days ago, and it will not return for another 5 weeks. Your breath freezes instantly into crystals that fall to your chest like broken glass. Every piece of modern survival logic tells you the same thing. Find shelter, build fire, stay dry at all costs. But there is no shelter here. There is no wood, and the moisture from your own body is already beginning to kill you from the inside out. Within 3 hours, hypothermia will begin shutting down your nervous system. Within 6, you will be dead. And yet, for more than 4,000 years, entire civilizations did not merely survive these conditions. They raised children here. They grew old here. They laughed here. How is that possible? The answer is not what you expect. These people survived not by following the fundamental rules of cold weather survival, but by systematically violating almost every one of them. Modern survival training, whether military, civilian, or recreational, rests on a few foundational principles. Find or build an insulated shelter. Create fire for warmth and signaling. Keep your clothing absolutely dry, because wet fabric conducts heat away from your body up to 25 times faster than dry fabric. Eat cooked food to maximize caloric extraction and avoid parasites. Stay awake if you are dangerously cold. Move to generate heat. These principles work in temperate forests. They work in mountain environments. They even work in deserts. They do not work on Arctic sea ice. And the peoples who mastered this environment understood why. When European explorers first encountered the Inuit peoples across the Arctic regions of North America, Greenland, and Siberia, they were bewildered. Here were communities living in conditions that killed trained European sailors within days, and yet they appeared comfortable, well-fed, even prosperous. The explorers assumed this was the result of genetic adaptation, or perhaps some mysterious tolerance for suffering. They were wrong. What they were witnessing was not tolerance. It was technology so sophisticated, so precisely calibrated to the physics of extreme cold, that it remained invisible to outside observers who lacked the framework to understand it. Consider the question of fire. Every survival manual in the Western tradition treats fire as the cornerstone of staying alive in cold environments. But fire requires fuel. In the high Arctic, above the tree line, there is no wood. Driftwood appears occasionally along coastlines, but it cannot be relied upon. Burning animal fat is possible, but the calories expended gathering, processing, and maintaining a fat-fueled fire often exceed the thermal benefit received. More critically, fire creates a heat differential. When you warm one side of your body and leave the other side exposed to extreme cold, you create a convective current that actually accelerates heat loss from the unheated side. Arctic peoples understood this implicitly. Their solution was not to generate external heat, but to prevent internal heat from escaping in the first place. Fire became a tool for light, for cooking when conditions permitted, for social gathering. But it was never the primary survival mechanism. That role belonged to an entirely different system. The clothing technology developed across Arctic cultures represents one of the most sophisticated thermal engineering achievements in human history. And it was built entirely from organic materials using Stone Age tools. Archaeological evidence from sites across Arctic Canada, Alaska, and Greenland reveals garments constructed with a precision that rivals modern technical outerwear. The key innovation was the deliberate use of caribou hide, specifically winter caribou hide, harvested at precisely the right time of year when the hollow core guard hairs reached optimal length and density. These hairs are not solid. Each one contains a sealed air pocket that provides exceptional insulation while remaining remarkably lightweight. Clothing made from summer caribou hide offers perhaps 40% less thermal protection. The timing of the hunt was not random. It was a thermal engineering decision encoded into cultural practice, but the genius extended beyond material selection. Arctic clothing was constructed in 2 layers, and here is where modern assumptions completely collapse. The inner layer was worn with the fur facing inward against the skin. The outer layer was worn with the fur facing outward toward the environment. Between these 2 layers existed a critical air gap maintained by the structural properties of the garments themselves. This air gap functioned as a buffer zone. Moisture from the body would migrate outward through the inner layer, where it would freeze in the air gap rather than saturating the clothing itself. The frozen moisture could then be beaten out of the garments each evening before it accumulated. This was not passive, it was active moisture management, performed daily as an essential survival ritual. And this brings us to the most counterintuitive principle of all. In the Arctic, you do not simply try to stay dry, you manage where and when you become wet. Exertion produces sweat. Sweat migrates into clothing. If that moisture freezes against your skin during rest periods, you will die. Arctic hunters understood that they had to calibrate their effort precisely, working just hard enough to accomplish necessary tasks, but never so hard that they triggered heavy perspiration. When they felt themselves beginning to sweat, they stopped. They opened vents in their clothing. They slowed their pace. They sometimes removed layers entirely, exposing themselves to ambient cold that would terrify a modern observer, specifically to prevent moisture accumulation. This practice looks reckless. It was the opposite. It was rigorous thermal discipline. Sleeping presented another lethal challenge. At night, metabolic rates drop. Heat production decreases. The danger of hypothermia peaks during rest, not during activity. European explorers who encountered this problem attempted to solve it by building fires, by piling on blankets, by staying awake in shifts. These strategies consumed calories, burned through limited fuel, and exhausted participants. Arctic peoples approached the problem differently. They understood that the human body is itself a furnace, generating heat continuously through metabolic processes. The goal was not to add heat from outside, but to capture and retain the heat already being produced. The igloo, perhaps the most misunderstood structure in survival history, was not a house. It was a thermal capture system. Snow is an exceptional insulator because it contains approximately 95% trapped air. An igloo constructed from properly centered snow blocks, cut with precise angles and sealed with applied water that freezes into an airtight shell, creates an interior environment dramatically different from the exterior. Outside temperature of -40 can coexist with interior temperature of +32 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained entirely by the body heat of 4 or 5 occupants and a single small oil lamp. The entrance tunnel slopes downward and then rises again, creating a cold trap that prevents warm air from escaping and cold air from flowing in. The sleeping platform is elevated, positioned in the warmest zone of the dome. Nothing about this design is accidental. It is applied physics, built from frozen water. Sleep itself was a communal act. Families slept together, bodies arranged for maximum heat sharing, with the most vulnerable, the children and elderly, positioned in the center where temperatures remained highest. Furs were shared. Heat was pooled. The Western notion of individual bedding, of personal space during rest, would have been seen not as civilized but as suicidal. Survival was collective, or it did not happen at all. Nutrition in these environments defied every principle that governed temperate zone eating. Cooking destroys vitamin C. In a forested environment, this poses no danger because fruits, vegetables, and fresh plant material replenish the nutrient easily. In the Arctic, where plant matter is virtually non-existent for most of the year, cooking your food means developing scurvy within months. Arctic peoples ate raw meat, raw fish, and raw organ tissue, not because they lacked the technology to cook, but because cooking would have killed them. The practice that European observers found most revolting was in fact a precise nutritional adaptation. Blubber and fat, consumed in quantities that would cause immediate cardiovascular distress in sedentary populations, provided the caloric density necessary to sustain body temperature in extreme cold. A human body in a -40 environment requires approximately 5,000 calories per day simply to maintain core temperature. Fat delivers 9 calories per gram, protein delivers 4. The mathematics of survival dictated the diet. Compare this to the Franklin expedition of 1845, the most famous disaster in Arctic exploration history. 129 British sailors entered the Canadian Arctic with the full technological might of the Victorian Empire. Steam-powered ships, tinned food, coal-burning stoves, European wool and cotton clothing. They had everything. Every man perished. The reasons were multiple, but the underlying cause was singular. They brought a survival paradigm designed for temperate Europe into an environment that operated on completely different physical principles. Their wool clothing absorbed moisture and lost its insulating properties. Their tinned food was sealed with lead solder, slowly poisoning them. Their coal-burning stoves required fuel that had to be rationed desperately. They refused to adopt native clothing, native diet, native hunting techniques, because doing so would have meant abandoning their identity as civilized Englishmen. Pride killed them. Inuit communities, who inhabited the same region and encountered the same conditions, watched with bewilderment. They offered assistance. Some of that assistance was accepted too late. The Franklin disaster was not a failure of technology in the abstract sense. It was a failure to recognize that technology is only valuable if it matches the physics of the environment in which it operates. Modern experimental archaeology has put these traditional methods to rigorous testing. Researchers in Canada, Scandinavia, and Alaska have constructed traditional igloos, worn replicas of traditional caribou clothing, consumed traditional high-fat diets, and operated under conditions of complete fuel deprivation. The results consistently validate what oral histories described for centuries. A properly constructed igloo maintains interior warmth indefinitely with minimal heat input. Traditional clothing outperforms modern synthetic gear in extended cold exposure, particularly once moisture becomes a factor. The deliberate management of perspiration, the counterintuitive practice of exposing skin to cold at controlled intervals, prevents the cascading moisture accumulation that dooms modern hikers in unexpected cold snaps. This is not to suggest that traditional Arctic survival was comfortable or free of risk. Mortality rates were significant. Injury, starvation, predators, and accidents killed many people. But what the record shows is that catastrophic death from environmental cold, the kind of death that claims modern individuals within hours, was remarkably rare among populations who followed traditional systems. The danger came from breakdowns in the system, from hunting failures or equipment loss. It did not come from mere exposure. The deepest lesson here has nothing to do with the Arctic specifically. It has to do with how humans survive in any extreme environment. The difference between those who die and those who endure is rarely strength. It is rarely courage. It is certainly not tolerance for suffering. The difference is systems thinking. The peoples who mastered the Arctic did not fight the cold. They did not endure it through grit. They engineered around it, layer by layer, decision by decision, building a civilization-scale survival machine that operated so smoothly it became invisible, indistinguishable from culture itself. What looks like tradition is often technology. What looks like instinct is often calculation. And what looks like primitive toughness is often the opposite. The accumulated intelligence of generations who understood that survival belongs not to the strong, but to the prepared.